Wanker, you lot of fucking Yanks think Davy Grant didn't win 30-27? Can you slobs cross the pond even see a telly through them leering lard sacks you call eyes? All those globber knots and bretty stacks and Wellington ensembles with letters clotting up floaty your head, yeah? You bloody Ameriblimps got baby blimpy bounces if you think Daniel Marcos won that fight. Damage? You all cry damage, yeah? The only damage that Peruvian did in those 15 minutes was to his own hair colour, alright? Bunch of slippery, dippery long movers did mark them scorecards right up for the Mohawk bastard, didn't they? Bisping said it himself. Judges didn't reward the right thing in here. You mound and nutty gun fruit spleggings can point to any scoring criteria till all motorised rolling'ems come chugging back long them cobbley stone clippity clops. Davy Grant, 30-27. And if I see MMA Rax round London anytime soon, get ready for a pippity-pip gollywog lobotomy, right? Jeez, that was David from Wallingsford upon Shirehampton, which is a very real place in the United Kingdom. That was from 2 weeks ago, which was the last time the MMA RAXPOD did a show. And David wasn't very happy about the way the Daniel Marcos-Davy Grant fight turned out. So I felt obligated to share that very, very authentic message I got at MMA Rax Info, the email handle. So I'm sorry, David, that it turned out that way. But you Brits, you need to get over yourselves. I mean, look at just what happened to Jake Hadley, for fuck's sake. My God. Anyway, welcome to the MMA RAXPOD. We're delighted to be back, even though we're coming off of 2 losing weekends. So probably, I'm sure some people are like, "Oh, he's ducking the losses after such a nice ride." But listen, I have capped every UFC event outside of one in March of 2022, the one before UFC London, going back to last February, Fight Night, Makhachev Green. This shit is exhausting, bro. Especially when you're doing it for free. But I do it because we're trying to boost the profile of the sport. But I have a life outside of this too. And, I'd have another podcast outside of this too that is a bit more successful than this one, even though I'm sharing the knowledge for free here. So I have to allocate my energy accordingly. I still got all the picks out, even though we had some flubs. The Jeremiah Wells loss was obviously devastating, but we have a new event to get onto, and that's UFC Vegas 78. So I'm thinking at some point it'll probably be good to do a show in which I just go over like a quarterly review of losses that were favorites. And in this case, that would include Jake Hadley and Jeremiah Wells and Ignacio Bahamondes. I really do need to take another look at the Bahamondes fight, given how lopsided it was with Klein, who did the same thing to Mason Jones last year when Mason Jones was a minus 400 favorite. So there's obviously things that need to be looked at and reevaluated with that performance that I, wasn't really privy to at that point because I had already been kind of blindsided by the Wells loss. I didn't even really get to watch the Diego Lopez submission or Dustin Jacoby's knockout. And I rightfully went to bed before watching the snooze fest Sandhagen put on, but that plus 4.5 was at better value than the minus, and I just didn't understand that given the propensity for each of those guys to avoid getting finished. So Glad to see that it played out that way. Sandhagen, I think, cemented himself as a title contender. He deserves the shot right away. It's funny to hear Dillashaw making all this noise after that terrible split decision, and you just wonder how different fate would be if something had gone a bit differently in favor of Sandhagen. But here we are now. He looks as complete as ever in what is an extremely deep weight class. If this is really it for Sterling, I mean, even if Sterling vacates the title after beating O'Malley, regardless of whether O'Malley's champion or not, it'll be interesting to see Sterling, move up. But I am very excited about Sandhagen, seeing what the betting line would be for him in a title shot against pretty much anybody other than Aljamain, and that includes O'Malley. I think if O'Malley had to fight a guy who has already established himself as a high-level elite dominator like Sandhagen, that could go very poorly. And for some reason, I feel like O'Malley would be favored in that, or it would at least be a pick'em. I don't know why, but the lofty perception of O'Malley right now is insane, and it could be even greater coming off of that Sterling performance, depending on what happens, given Sterling's already indicated he's kind of out of it after this fight. So we'll see what goes on, but I will do a quarterly recap for those favorite misses. I think that'll be a better way to summarize things going forward. As it stands, I've got about 9 fights to go over. 8 with a no pick, but 1 fight with 2 picks. So 8 total. So we'll get into all of them. And I owed this to you guys earlier in the day, but I'm, like I said, duty calls. It's real life. So Martin Buday and Josh Parisian. So here's the thing. This fight has the perception of being a sloppy heavyweight bout, but I think a sloppy heavyweight bout has to go 2 ways. And to the credit of Buday, I picked him over Collier in the last fight because I believed over the course of a 15-minute fight, he would show better head protection than Collier did. He not only did that, but he also showed better gas tank management, pulled off a very classic rope-a-dope. Collier tried to finish him in the first round, wasn't able to do so, which was the same thing we saw happen with Chris Barnett. And that gassing out of Collier allowed Buday to just kind of piece him up over the last 10 minutes. And you saw, even though people have said Buday has, a problem with keeping his chin in the air or whatever, I mean, he's a 6'4", stocky heavyweight. He does max out at that 265. But he's, better built than these guys like Parisian or even former heavyweight Chris Daukaus, who we're going to talk about later, that, are much more doughy. He's got better cardio, and it's reflected in the fact that he's never been finished. The only loss of his career is to the former Spain legend Juan Espino, who was famously on his way to dethroning Alexander Romanov's undefeated record before that fight was unceremoniously stopped. And with it kind of halted all the momentum of Espino's MMA career as well. But Buday has only lost by decision, and that was in his second MMA fight ever, which was coming off of 2 years of ring rust. He hasn't lost since. His only finish was on Contender Series. I spoke last week about how leaning into fighters that rely on going to decision at heavyweight isn't a strategy for success. So I don't like that from Buday. but you have to consider the person that he's fighting here, which is an opponent that I have liked and respected in the past, in Josh Parisian. I wanted to pick Parisian over Chase Sherman, I believe he was fighting, and he had that panic attack, I believe, after, I believe it might have been after the weigh-ins. I ended up hitting the parlay that I put him out with on a 4-leg. He was at plus odds, and I thought he was very, very live to beat Chase Sherman. And I think that's reflected in how Chase Sherman's recent UFC performances have gone. But, I mean, that was about a year ago. That was after he nearly lost to Alan Badeau in a fight where I put out the pick for him to win during the first month of MMA Rax going live in June of last year. And I was grateful that Parisian was able to win, but it was against an opponent that was very sloppy and has since been released from the UFC, and was at the time kind of looking forward to like, oh, I can't wait to be on the Paris card. Kind of assumed that he was Alan Badeau, and because he's from France, and just got totally released because he was sloppy bad. That was one of 2 wins Parisian has had across in the UFC. He's 2-3. He did have 2 finishes on Contender Series. Again, you have to consider that these aren't really names on this Contender Series appearance list that have since gone on to greater things in MMA necessarily. The only other win in the UFC that Parisian has had was against Roque Martinez, who never won in the UFC. Went 1-1 in his appearances since being released from the UFC after losing a split decision to Josh Parisian in 2021. So not a guy that has had a lot of high-level success, and a guy that was 35 years old when he fought Parisian. So Parisian's only had success against a guy who's been a sloppy quitter and someone who never won in the UFC. Otherwise lost a unanimous decision to a solid veteran in Parker Porter. Knocked out by a frighteningly inconsistent heavyweight in Don'Tale Mayes, who most recently only had his greatest success against a 44-year-old Andrei Arlovsky. And then got dominated up until I think around the end of the fight, perhaps, against Jamal Pogues, who just got upset by Mick Parkin in his UFC debut. So the 2-1 odds here are more than justified. I can't believe that the price has kind of been dipping slowly below that. It hasn't really ballooned out in the way that I expected. And I think it could be honestly further even out than that. I would play Buday here probably out to the 300 range, if I'm being honest. This is like, if you want to talk about levels of the game, I look at the heavyweight division. There's 2 different classes of heavyweights. There's like the guys that are like legit, maybe even 3 at this point because of how much John Jones separated himself from Cyril Gane. I still think Pavlovich could probably give him a run for it. But my point is, there's like the guys that are the legitimate contenders and like the ones that deserve to be considered for ranking. And then there's the bottom slops. That's your Jake Collier's, your Chase Sherman's, your Josh Parisians, your Chris Barnett's, your Lucas Brzeski's. These are the guys that Carl Williams is supposed to 30-26. But Martin Buday is not quite in that class because he's already proven he can outclass those guys over 15 minutes, which is an annoying way to win at heavyweight. Not a good strategy for high-level success. But Parisian's not a high-level opponent. He's the caliber of Barnett and Collier and Brzezinski. These are all guys that he's proven he can beat by going the distance before. And we've seen Parisian lose in the UFC predominantly by going the distance. The path to victory is very well written here. And I think this is about it for Parisian. He was very grateful when he got that bonus, I believe, over Buday, and I think he spent it on a truck right away. If he loses here by decision, I think he should probably get at least one more shot. But he will be 2-4 with one win off of a split and another in which he got knocked down and both sides gassed out. So we know what he is at this point at 34. Buday, at least we're gonna see him lose at the UFC at some point, but this doesn't feel like it's the place for it. Seems like he's in a pretty good spot to go 13-1. So I'm, depending on where the value stays, I'm hoping he doesn't get out to the 200 range. He's sitting at 194 right now. So if he does sit right below there, I just refreshed. Now he's out to 208. I still think I'm gonna make him a leg just because I have no confidence in Parisian relative to what I saw from Buday against Collier. So give me Martin Buday all day, every day. At least every day he's fighting Parisian. The next fight is Terrance McKinney and Mike Brennan. I forgot to bring up the Fight Center list for these, so I have all my picks written down, but I just tried to do the opponent off rip. Although I have the betting table open here too, so I should have just looked at that. Mike Breeden. Terrance McKinney and Mike Breeden. We're going off rip. All right, here's the thing. Breeden's been knocked out in the first 90 seconds in 2 of his last 4 losses, and he hasn't fought since he faced off with, I believe, Natan Levy last year. I picked Levy to win that. I was a little bit nervous watching it just because you want a fighter that is more conducive for getting finishes than what we've seen from Levy of late. But Levy's still, for the most part, dominated. So this is a guy that has not won in the UFC. He has 1 win in Bellator in his debut in 2017, and it was on an injury. He had a lot of finishing success on his way to Contender Series, but he lost his Contender Series appearance to Anthony Romero, who didn't get a contract, and most recently lost this year to Olivier Aubin-Mercier by knockout in the PFL. Since then, Breeden got knocked out by Alexander Hernandez. I'm not sure if his debut was short notice, but he had been knocked out previously in 2018 as well in the first minute of that fight. So this is a guy who's been put out. He's only been fighting for 6 years, and he's been knocked out twice in the first 90 seconds of 2 of his losses. He has a 0-0 submission record, so it's unclear where that's probably going to go if McKinney could exploit that. But we've seen McKinney spark people in the early stages of fights before. You have to imagine the reason that McKinney jumped on this is because he's desperate to reverse the momentum of his career at this point, because he's had a handful of letdown performances now. It's important to remember he was favored to beat Bonfim. And Bonfim's stock has fallen dramatically from the loss to Benoit Saint-Denis. So that loss by transitive property makes McKinney look even worse because McKinney got dominated and really didn't look like he knew what to do against Bonfim. The performance against Sadikov, even though I bet against McKinney, I literally made Sadikov a parlay leg, was more encouraging. We did see him get to the triangle. We didn't really see him do much with it, but the fact that he was able to get him in that position in the first round and take advantage was encouraging. But you saw the issue with the creativity with McKinney in terms of going back to the corner and re-strategizing. In the second, coming out, not executing a game plan that was conducive to him succeeding, and Sadikov pouncing and being more of an opportunist and getting a finish. Breeden doesn't have that kind of technical ability and freshness, the lack of ring rust that Sadikov did against McKinney. He doesn't have the finishing potential, nor the Brazilian crowd cheering him on that Bonfim did against McKinney. Breeden's going into the Apex against a guy that very nearly beat Drew Dober, that sparked Matt Frivola, that sparked Fares Ziam. This is a guy who, in the first round, is as dangerous as anybody in the weight class, but we just know that beyond that, it gets weird. But Breeden is ripe bait, and that is why McKinney is taking this opportunity. So I think McKinney should be probably even a greater favorite. The first round KO McKinney prop is, I think, an extremely obvious play here. So I would go run with that. This guy has too much of a following that he doesn't know how to utilize and capitalize on. There's just so much potential here that needs to be figured out. And I think the UFC, even though the narrative on McKinney seems to be a little like, oh, we know who he is at this point. Well, we know what his weaknesses are. The question is, can those weaknesses get corrected? He's still in the range where things can be turned around. I'm optimistic. This is a great turnaround spot for McKinney. I think we're going to see it, and I think when we see the potential again of what this guy can do, it will be reassessed that, okay, we expected too much too soon of this guy who wasn't ready for it. Let's put him on a more realistic development arc where maybe we can see this guy being a ranked fighter again at some point, or being a contender for the rankings rather. So give me McKinney by first round knockout. Breeden hasn't fought in over a year. I think this is going to be a classic example of ring rust rearing its ugly head. The next fight is Marcus McGhee and JP Buys. Buys? Who knows? This is kind of a ridiculous line. I don't think you can realistically play McGhee at a 300 price tag, given we've seen one performance from him on short notice, and it was impressive. People are like, one of the most impressive short notice UFC debuts ever. Okay, that's not a reason to bet a guy at 300. Particularly when he's facing someone that has had success in the UFC, is just kind of down on, you don't want to say down on his luck, but everybody at this point knows the struggles that Buys has gone through, and that's a very unfortunate thing to deal with when you have that kind of a public romance with someone in your profession. It's just another reason why you shouldn't mix business with pleasure. quite literally. However, Buys hasn't fought since getting knocked out by Cody Durden. I expect this to be yet another example of why ring rust really, really sucks. Because even though I just chided the fact that McGhee's only had that debut, he has fought 4 more times since Buys got knocked out in the first minute against JP Buys. No, I fucked that up so bad. Since JP Buys got knocked out against Cody Durden in the first minute. Anyway. Prior to that, what's his name? Buys had not fought since facing Montel Jackson in September of 2021, in which he lost by unanimous decision. So this guy's only success has been 1 Contender Series appearance. He's been knocked out twice in the UFC. He also got knocked out on his first Contender Series appearance. Every time this guy has stepped up and tried to elevate his game, it hasn't measured up. People usually get cut after 3 losses. This is a tough spot for this guy to be in his 4th spot, and you have to think that he's going to get cut. What's worse is this is only his 2nd appearance in the last 2 years, and the only other appearance he got knocked out by a guy who's not a big knockout guy. Durden, who won last week and is good, admittedly is very good. I backed him against Charles Johnson. I should have backed him against Carlos Mata. I did back him against JP Buys. I was skeptical of his ability given that Mikhaev jumped him in the first minute of their fight when I really started aggressively betting this sport last year. But this is a guy that fought Chris Gutierrez to a draw because of a 10-8 that he picked up in the 3rd round. He beat Ariki Long. His only losses are some weird standout submission losses in the UFC. He's gone on to prove that he's very good. But his only knockout win in the UFC for all that success was JP Buys. So Durden is not a knockout specialist, and he was still able to finish him and hurt Buys that quickly. I don't think Buys is in a position, unfortunately, where he's going to be able to compete with someone like McGhee that just had the success that he did against Jordy Newson. And McGhee is a guy that has won all of his fights by finish. So I don't expect Buys to be the person that takes McGhee to the deep waters, so to speak. This is a guy, Buys, who has never won a fight by decision himself. He has more wins by disqualification than decision. That's phenomenally rare. So I can understand the price tag on McGhee. I don't think it is justified given the experience. I think the much more compelling thing here is the under, which when I put the pick out earlier in the week, it was basically a pick 'em. If I look at it again now, it is down to 140, so it has lost about 20 points of value since I put that pick out. I think I'm going to make this a parlay leg. I don't think Buys is going to be able to compete with McGhee at this point, based on what we saw. McGhee, I believe, is at MMA Lab, and they've got quite a few good folks coming out of there lately between O'Malley and Cannonier and some other names that are on the UFC roster. So I'm much more encouraged by his level of upkeep and pairing that with the fact that he had that success in his debut on short notice. Now he's got a more full camp relative to Buys coming back with the ring rust he had between not only getting knocked out, but the layoff prior to getting knocked out as well. So the under, I think, is a right play here. I expect McGhee to get a very good finish. But maybe Buys surprises him. Who knows? That's the beauty of taking the under, is you assume all the upside so that you don't get caught with your pants down if a guy that's only had one win by second round submission makes a mistake. But Jordy Newson, I mean, if he fought JP Buys, what do you think that line would be fight would be lined at? I'm fumbling my words so bad tonight, but the point is, give me the under. It's minus 140. I think pairing that with Buday, and then we'll get into what could be the, one more pick later on in the evening. But give me those two, and we'll go forward from there. The next fight is Josh Fremd and the immaculate, illustrious, incredible, unstoppable Jamie Pickett. It's fucking disgusting that Jamie Pickett is on another main card. What the fuck are they doing over there at the Ultimate Fighting Championship matchmaking office? This is fucking horrendous. Jamie Pickett sucks. I don't like to disparage these fighters. Jamie Pickett is a middleweight. I would guess he has a longer reach, is taller than me, could probably beat my ass. Probably, I say. But goddamn, the reason I'm angry is because I remember picking him to beat Dennis Tululian, and I still don't think Tululian is that good. I don't even know if I'm saying his name right, but it was so discouraging watching that performance. It left a horrible taste in my mouth. I imagine it left a horrible taste in the mouth of Dana White as well. And that is why he served him up to Bo Nickel. And to the credit of Mr. Pickett, he did survive the early onslaught from Nickel, but Nickel eventually turned it up and was able to get the finish in the first round, which is what many expected. That was a very rare case in which you had a minus 1.5 that I believe was in the 300 to 400 range, and it still felt like a layup. All of Pickett's losses by submission have been in the first half of fights. Fremd, to his credit, it felt like he was put in a spot to fail against Cedric Dumas, and he completely flipped the script. He showed up looking huge. He's 6'4", which is, the same size as Adesanya and Pereira for a middleweight. That's a pretty considerable, size. He's got the length and the striking, and he deploys it well. And he also, even though the rep was that he wasn't quite sophisticated with the submissions on the UFC level after getting caught in that weird crank from Tresean Gore. I mean, Gore is a guy that fights with a little bit of desperation sometimes, so it was cool to see him get that finish, especially given his story and his background. But that was a case in which I played the under at plus odds, and it cashed in a Fremd fight in which he lost. So I hedged on rounds in that case because I actually graded Fremd to win, I believe, and I was worried that Gore was going to catch his chin because I didn't think he was UFC level at that point. I felt somewhat vindicated from that, watching that performance, and then that bias was sort of baked into my pick of Cedric Dumas over him, and Fremd showed that he can hang around. That is, I think, why he's favored so heavily here over Pickett, even though the narrative against Pickett has been quite clearly that the guy is not only not UFC level, but is massively just not a fun fighter. It was discouraging to watch him kind of, sell that pause in the action against Tiulian. It felt like more at that point he was just trying to, get out and survive and protect himself than anything else than actually try to win. So I try to stay out of like tropes. One of the very common ones in this sport is like, oh, that's a guy that'll fight for your money. Okay, there's better ways to illustrate that with things that actually matter than, just saying that a guy will do that. I didn't say Elves Brenner was a guy that will fight for your money when I picked him to beat Guram Kutataladze. You can go check the tape on it if you don't believe me. My point is, Jamie Pickett is not very good, and Josh Fremd has won by submission very recently against fighters that at least present more of a talent than what we've seen from Pickett and a will to win, so to say. I think Josh Fremd by submission is pretty clearly what's going to happen here. I think the UFC is pleasantly surprised with what they have seen from him. They were impressed, and they're rewarding him here with a guy that probably should have already been cut anyway. So the line here makes sense. It would be very surprising to see this go to decision. Even if it does, I'm not optimistic that Pickett would get the nod over, winning 10 minutes versus Fremd. Maybe he gets one round in which he looks a little more impressive, but I would still expect him to gas. Give me Josh Fremd by submission. I'm going to be taking the under because all of Pickett's losses by submission have been in the first half of fights. So if I think Fremd is going to tap him out, my guess it's going to happen in the first half of the fight. And the under was at plus odds when I called it, out to like plus 155, I believe. It's still at that price, so you can go have that. That's a nice plus odds play for this week. We'll be able to slap that on a 3-leg parlay and see where the night goes. So we'll be able to do that with any other potential dogs this evening, and I look forward to doing so. So give me Josh Fremd by submission. I'm going to hope it happens in the first round, but we'll say it happens in the early second if it's not that fortunate. The next fight is Tafon Nchukwi and AJ Dobson. Okay. Context is crucial when evaluating this sport, and it is shocking, I tell you, that I've seen so much optimism for Dobson this week. These are two fighters that have had extremely long layoffs, but it's important to recognize the level of competition that each guy has faced. Nchukwi was a round away from beating Azamat Murzakanov in March of last year. That Santos Ankalaev fight night, by the way, was the only event I have not graded in the last year. Okay? Going back to Makhachev Green in February, which was the first one I did. The only event I've skipped was Santos Ankalaev when Tafon and Nchukwi got knocked out by Azamat Murzakanov, which I did tape, by the way, obviously, because I'm referencing it now. Nchukwi had so much momentum prior to that. He had lost a majority decision to Junyoung Park, but he had a knockout on Contender Series, and he had another unanimous decision win over Mike Rodriguez. So he was cruising. I don't want to say cruising, but he looked far more impressive than Azamat Murzakanov. And then Murzakanov, I believe, got a flying knee in the early stages of round 3, and that completely flipped the script. So there are some chin concerns here with Nchukwi. Those were further validated against Carlos Olberg, but Olberg had a tremendous reach advantage in terms of striking preferences that I thought was going to be very exploitable. Again, you can go out or go look back in first month of MMA Rax existence. That was a big day because I picked Durden and Olberg both as underdogs to win. That was when Durden fought JP Buys on the same card that Olberg knocked out Nchukwi. So I remember these days well, very fondly. These were important formative days in establishing the accuracy of MMA Rax. I would have won big money that night if fucking Gamro didn't get the decision over Sarukian. Anyway, that's all the action for Tafon and Nchukwi. So Olberg's obviously great. He's the next city kickboxing export. Murzakanov upset Dustin Jacoby, and I believe is still undefeated. And you compare that to AJ Dobson, who I bet as a speculative underdog over a guy that has caused me more than a few headaches in Armin Petrosian, despite the fact that I graded him to beat Gregory Rodriguez in my first event ever. I don't know how you can watch that fight that Dobson had with Petrosian and feel confident picking him. His corner was screaming at him to throw, and he didn't fucking do anything. I can perfectly see how this fight is going to play out, especially given we've seen just 3 knockouts from Dobson in his 6 wins. He had a submission win on Contender Series. It was only the second one of his career. But this is a guy who prior to the UFC had... this is stunning now that I'm looking at this. He had 1 decision win in 2017. In his 5 other wins on his run to the UFC, all of his wins were in the first 2 minutes by finish. 1 was flipped to a no contest. Only 1 of those wins was beyond the first minute. I mean, the front-running narrative for this guy coming in was kind of obvious. I don't know if he was favored over Malkoun when he lost by decision. He did win by submission on Contender Series. I'm sure that tape, probably looking back, is probably one of the reasons I was speculative he could beat Petrosian when they were at not quite a pick'em, but he was definitely the underdog. But the Petrosian fight was gross. I mean, it's a red flag when a corner has to yell at their fighter and then they just don't end up doing shit. I wanted to give Kennedy Nchukwi the benefit of the doubt that he had resolved a lot of the fight IQ issues after beating oh my goodness. What is his name? No. I was going so good there for a minute. I'm sorry, folks, but you know this shit drives me nuts when I can't remember the names of these people. Devin Clark. Oh, that sucks that I remembered it as I was looking it up. God damn it. Yes, He almost got finished by Devin Clark, though. It's important to remember that, even though he ended up getting the finish. And I made him a parlay leg that night, and I was very grateful that he won. But my point is, Kennedy had previously shown many fight IQ issues that I thought were potentially going to put him in a compromising position. Also against Dustin Jacoby, and we saw how that played out last week. Dobson, you've seen that similar problem in terms of coaches advocating for their fighter to do something and then just not listening to them. That's a pattern that you should always keep in mind, just as kind of like a note of not good when you're looking at these guys. If you see a fight where the coaches are advocating for the fighter to do something, usually the commentary team will acknowledge when that's happening or when they themselves are saying a fighter should do something and then the fighter does it. They'll be like, oh, they listened. You even saw instances of that you see instances of that in the Apex all the time, actually, which I think is pretty fascinating about them hosting fights in that environment. In this case, Dobson is a guy that will, if he's not having that early front runner success that we've seen mostly his career is made up on, he doesn't know really what to do when the fight gets out of those first 5 minutes. Nchukwi can absolutely just make this a clean contest for him for 15 minutes. Murzakanov is a much more sophisticated opponent than Dobson, which is why I think he was able to flip the script in the way that he did. Even if Nchukwi is up 2 rounds to nothing going into the last 5 and Dobson's got to sell out, is he going to be in the position at that point where he's taking that much damage and he can do it? This feels like a good bounce back spot for Nchukwi. I'm going to be taking him to win here. I don't think it'll be by finish. We haven't seen Dobson get finished yet in his MMA career, but I think the finishing upside here definitely has to be with Nchukwi, despite the fact, at least beyond the first 5 minutes. If Dobson wins, he's going to need to knock him out. But we've seen Dobson get too frustrated too quickly to the point that he just doesn't really end up doing anything when he's facing a guy that is markedly more battle-tested than him, for you to feel good about him here, despite the fact that you think that he may have the grappling upside or whatnot. These guys are going to want to trade with each other. It's what we saw Dobson want to do against Petrosian. When Petrosian didn't give him any avenues to victory, he just got frustrated and kind of shut down. I kind of think the same thing is going to happen here over the last 10 minutes. So give me Tafon and Nchukwi. And now we get to the true sloppy heavyweight fight of the evening, even though it's really a light heavyweight fight. And that is Khalil Rountree Jr. and Chris Daukaus. Okay, if you follow this sport, then you understand the narrative of how it usually goes with these weight cuts. When a guy adds weight, you are curious about how his gas tank is going to hold up. An interesting example of that to monitor later is going to be Rafael dos Anjos if that fight goes to the later stages. Because we did see how his welterweight gas tank went with Fiziev last year in his most recent loss. The inverse of that is when a fighter cuts weight, moves down a weight class, you want to observe how their chin is going to hold up. I think a very, very good example of a fighter that I didn't trust at all with their weight cut, even though I picked him to win, I because of his opponent was so inexperienced, Tanner Boser. Bad chin at heavyweight, cut weight, looked like in crazy shape, of like almost like weird shape, sort of, when he weighed in against Ion Cutelaba. And Cutelaba just hurt him early and often and bad. It was tough watching that. And even last week, it looked like he was getting hurt pretty often against that Alexa guy, Kamer, I believe, who hadn't fought in over 2 years. But Bozer, every time that it looked like he was going to get ready to press on the gas for the finish, Kamer would catch him with like a counter, and it wouldn't. He looked like he would get wobbled just like momentarily a little bit and have to recompose himself and be like, all right, I'm a level above this guy. I shouldn't be getting caught like that, so I need to keep this fight on my terms. So he got the 30-27, but it was I would hardly call it a graceful 30-27. It was kind of weird. That I literally fell asleep watching that fight. That's why I didn't tweet out my picks that were all excellent last week. I only tweeted out my losses. That must have been an interesting thing for people to witness. I haven't fallen asleep watching an MMA event before, but that fight literally put me to sleep. The point is, you really need to be cautious of fighters that cut weight, that have demonstrated their chins stink. That's why it's so fucking funny that Chris Daukaus is fighting Khalil Rountree. This is such an irresponsible matchmaking. This feels like the UFC wants Daukaus out. I mean, it's baffling. He's been knocked out 3 fights in a row. All of his UFC appearances have ended in the first half, regardless of whether they've been wins or losses. But the under, I believe, in the Rosenstrike fight that he was last in was it was like a minus 155, I think, and I just couldn't believe it. I was like, if Rosenstrike catches him once early, it's done. It's so obvious to me. And the fight ended in 23 seconds. I believe Rosenstrike might have been in my minus 155, and the under was a little bit lower than I think it might have been minus 170, but I knew the under was such a safer play. This guy does not have the chin for this shit. We've seen it. He got brutalized by Blades, and Blades still put him out in the first half too. Daukaus, man. You got to get back to the boys in blue. They got to build a blue wall of silence around that chin of yours, Chief. The one thing I'm worried about with the under here is that we've seen Rountree get like too conservative, and I worry that, if Daukaus maybe catches him with a combination or something early, he might get to the point where he's like, okay, I can just put him out with one shot, and I need to wait for the perfect one. And then as they get settled in, you just see the opportunities for a finish kind of drift away. But again, Daukaus' chin is just so bad that you feel like if Rountree knows that he hurts him, he's going to deploy. I think that's one of the reasons that he and Jacoby kind of fought to a stalemate in their last appearance, which is extremely frustrating. I made Jacoby a parlay leg, and to watch that fight end in a split was absolutely disgusting and unacceptable. It's I made the joke, or we heard the joke in the opening of the show about fighters winning on damage. That was a classic example of which, because Jacoby had a little discoloration in his face, not even really bleeding, that was somehow more of a register that Rountree had won the rounds than Jacoby constantly landing on him from different angles, even though it wasn't illustrating as much damage. In a pure kickboxing match for 15 minutes, which is what that was, Jacoby landed more times. You would have thought he would have gotten rewarded for that, but he did not. I think that fight was a classic example of why the commission leaned into this subjective judging criteria, is because it allows for more ambiguous output of results, which is more favorable ultimately to the long-term promotional interests of the sport. You saw that just happen with Jan Blachowicz and Alex Pereira. With that in mind, I think you can deploy Rountree and the -1.5. I think Rountree first round TKO is very live. You might even get away with playing the first minute prop. This guy has no chin, and he just cut a shitload of weight. Biologically, we know what the pattern for that is. And he's facing a guy that has demonstrated he can be a nuclear hitter. I might hedge and put out two different three legs, that one that has Rountree and another that has the under. I still feel like both of them are pretty good for cashing, and they're basically at the same price. I'm just worried. It's just nice with the under, because it's like, oh, what if Daukaus actually catches him? Because we've seen Rountree get knocked out. I would feel way more confident playing Rountree if I knew that he wasn't going to get finished in the first half himself. But we've seen that happen on his own terms. The under realistically is the safer play, because all of Daukaus' UFC appearances have ended in the first half. Every single one. So that feels like the more certain play here. So I think the three-leg parlay tomorrow is going to be Martin Buday, and then the pair of unders of the McGhee JP Buys fight, as well as the under in Rountree Daukaus. But I might, as a hedge, if you do believe Rountree wins, it's possible that he drags it out a little bit further than necessary, which is why I think that there's reason enough to hedge there. So in the interest of ensuring that we don't, or trying to avoid a third winning weekend, or rather a third losing weekend in a row, even though we were coming off of, I believe, 5 winning ones in a row prior to that, I think I'm going to hedge here. I still expect Rountree to win in the first round, but this is a rare opportunity where you can hedge with rounds and the money line and still feel pretty good about both hitting. But in this case, because we're pairing this with two other results that we're more certain of, this hedge provides a nice insurance fail-safe. And if both of them go through, then the reward is doubled. But in the case of one or the other not hitting, whether it's Rountree dragging it out into the second half or Daukaus catching Rountree in the first half, I think this is a good case in which you hedge out on your parlays, and with your unit allocation, that at least makes sure that you come out ahead regardless of something weird happening. So I think this is the most interesting fight of the night from a value perspective betting-wise, because I think it's pretty obvious that Rountree is going to win by first-round TKO. But it could get weird depending on what he decides to do or how Daukaus leads the dance. So we'll see how that goes. The next fight is Hakeem Dawodu and Cub Swanson. All right, I don't think you can trust Dawodu here, so just don't bet this fight. Root for Cub Swanson. Don't put money on him. Root for the UFC legend, the UFC Hall of Famer, as many like to speak on. Don't bet on him. Dawodu is a 2-1 favorite for a reason. However, Dawodu has proven he does not deserve to be a 2-1 favorite based on the performance against Julian Erosa. That was another big credibility night for your boy. Because I put out Johnny Walker and Julian Erosa for that event when Walker fought Kutalaba and Dawodu fought Erosa. I believe it was UFC 279. I could be mistaken. However, many folks were on Walker that week. So I felt good, even though both guys were plus 180. I was like, oh, it was cool that, I'd see that underdog cash. You're always happy when at least one dog pick goes through. But nobody was on Erosa. Not a soul on MMA Twitter, gambling Twitter. None of those fucking people were on Erosa. Not one. It was me on an island by myself. And boy, when I had not even 300 followers last year, I was hearing about it. I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. Dawodu all day. Blah, blah, blah. I don't want to hear it. And guess what? Dawodu missed weight. I said smash those Erosa picks. And boy howdy, Julian came out and gave him the work all over the cage, on the feet, on the fence, on the floor. 30-27, gave him the business. I didn't win shit that night, but I was so happy from a picks credibility perspective because I saw so many other people that were like, bro, I made money on this shit because you told me to do it and nobody else did. And that is exactly what I want for this platform. Even on the nights where I don't make money, people that more confidently bet the straights than me, because I'm just a parlay fiend, can still make money off of this work. So that work has yielded another hypothesis that you shouldn't bet on Dawodu at 2-1. Just root for Swanson and enjoy the show. The finishing upside is going to be with Dawodu, obviously, but have we seen a finish from the guy in the UFC? I will ask the question again. Have we seen a finish from Hakeem Dawodu in the UFC? Because you would think that would be the most surefire path to victory for beating Cub Swanson. And we have seen one knockout against Yoshinori Horii in 2019. Yoshinori Horii, who that was his only UFC appearance, fought in Pancrase exclusively prior to that, and has had one appearance in Ryzen since, which he won by unanimous decision. That was over 2 years after he got knocked out by Dawodu in the final minute of their fight. So all of other Dawodu's appearances, I mean, it's flat. The guy's had 3 split decision wins in the UFC. He's had 2 unanimous decisions, 3 splits. And the names aren't jump off the page guys either. Zabario, Tukov, Julio Arce, fine. He did beat Trezano. Cool. Trezano's off the roster. No longer the tough winner we thought he was. Movsar Evloev gave him the business, although I believe Dawodu was able to wobble him a little bit at the end of that fight. But I really did believe that Erosa was going to beat him. and was more experienced and had more success in the UFC, and that proved as such. I think Dawodu should win here because Swanson has like demonstrated that he's on his way out at this stage, but the guy is so much more battle tested in terms of level of competition than Dawodu is that I think this fight is going to be weird. I think it's a sleepy fight of the night contender. We've already seen Swanson fight in those. If Dawodu doesn't have the finishing potential to put Swanson out early, which he hasn't demonstrated against anyone in the UFC, this could get really, really interesting the longer it goes, and I expect it to. And if it's going to be interesting, you don't have to bet on it. Just fucking enjoy it as a fan. So I'm going to be rooting for Cub Swanson. I graded Dawodu to win. The price tag is not appropriate, so I'm not going to bet it. There's plenty of other spots on this card, and I would encourage you to do the same. The main event is Rafael dos Anjos and Vincente Luque, or as they would say in Wisconsin, Rafael dos Anjos. I grew up in Chicago, so I'm allowed to make that joke. The Packers fucking suck, by the way. Anyway, the narrative about this fight is that Luque is coming back from a brain bleed, so that's why he's the underdog. Ridiculous. He's medically cleared. I watched the end of the Jeff Neal fight, and I was trying to figure out when that would have happened. And if you watch when he got knocked out, he hit his head on the canvas pretty bad. And then it looked like Keith Peterson almost kicked him in the head. He didn't kick him, but his foot kind of like slid into the top of his head where it hit the canvas in a way that probably wasn't good. I would imagine the brain bleed had already happened when his head hit, because the front of his head literally smacks the canvas while he's unconscious. So while Jeff Neal did knock him out, it was more of the falling after going unconscious that did the brain bleed that was the problem. Keith Peterson, prevented him from suffering worse, regardless of what happened with his foot. So it was unfortunate to see. It was surprising to see Luque get hurt like that. He got wobbled several times in the first round. What was really interesting was none of the judges gave Luque round 2. And the judging of that fight was ultimately discarded because of the finish, but it was already receiving heavy criticism because only one of the judges gave Neal a 10-8 in the first round, which, I mean, listen, he visibly wobbled Luque at least 3 times, I believe, and got a knockdown. He hurt him pretty bad. He didn't necessarily get it to a completely compromising stage. But I think you can make a case that Neal deserved a 10-8. What was more flummoxing was Luque landed more volume and more diversified volume without taking really that same visible wobblage, if you want to call it that, throughout round 2. But the judges didn't give him round 2, and many were critical of the fact that it should have been, I believe, 9. It would have been 19-18, I believe, at that point. So 10-8 to Neal in the first round, and then 10-9 to Luque in the second. But none of those scorecards reflected that. All of them gave 10-9 to Neal in round 2. You can judge it for yourself. I think Luque did win the second round, but I again, Neal very clearly took round 1 to the point where I think if you're considering damage the most important thing, he got the first one. But it's not like he caused the brain bleed in round 1. He hurt Luque, which was impressive because Luque's never been knocked out. We saw Luque almost get finished against Chiesa too, when Chiesa was still running with the Wolves. So against guys that have proven to be high-level finishing threats, Luque, has shown a propensity to get caught by some of those people. Do you really think Rafael dos Anjos has the same kind of ability to hurt Luque that Jeff Neal did and does? Rafael dos Anjos got knocked out by a head kick a year ago. Like, put out bad after fighting a world-class kickboxer in Fiziev for 20 minutes. The welterweight success he has had has been... I believe the Moicano fight was a catchweight. But this is not a guy that has had a lot of success in this weight class since his move up. It's really kind of surprising, to be honest. This is someone who has proven he can, against longer, rangier strikers, he's proven he can have success. He did beat Neil Magny by submission in 2017. But this guy's high-level welterweight success hasn't been there the way that it was when he was fighting at lightweight. It just hasn't been. So he submitted Kevin Lee, but we've seen how Kevin Lee's career has gone. Split decision over Felder. The Moicano win was short notice, and Moicano, by some miracle, was actually winning the 5th round of that fight, even though the narrative coming out of that is that he got dominated. So we've seen... And the other important thing to keep in mind relative to that is that was the first appearance from Dos Anjos in over a year and a half, I believe. His last appearance was against Paul Felder in November of 2020, and then he didn't fight again until March of 2022. And he wasn't going to fight with the cancellation if Moicano didn't step up. As I believe Moicano referred to in his interview, he was eating steaks and drinking beer. This is his interview after he beat Brad Riddell. He was eating steaks and drinking beer when he got the call to go fight Dos Anjos and, put his not his career in jeopardy, but, compromise some momentum it had. So that was the start of the 2-1 record that Dos Anjos had last year. And then he got the work from Fiziev and finished in spectacular fashion. And then he got a get right spot against Barberena, who we knew was ripe submission bait and has since proven to not really be a threat at welterweight. And moved up to middleweight and got completely dominated by Muradov in his most recent appearance. So in Barberena's swan song for the weight class, we saw him get put out by a future UFC Hall of Famer. That and the short notice Moicano appearance are all the UFC success that Dos Anjos has had since the end of 2020. If you go back further than that to 2018, Rafael dos Anjos is 4-5. Now the losses are to Covington and Usman and Leon Edwards. That's 3 champions right there. And then you add in Chiesa when he was running with the Wolves. And knocked out by Fiziev, who's a world-class kickboxer. I'm not saying Luque is a future champion, but it's important to remember the momentum that this guy had in his own UFC career before last year happened. This is a guy that main evented with Bilal Muhammad and was 1 round off of winning the fight on at least one judge's scorecard. He did lose a unanimous decision. He got out-wrestled by Bilal, but that wouldn't be the first time we saw Gilbert Burns get outstruck by him. We've seen Bilal evolve as a fighter before our eyes over the last year. Very good fighter. No shame in losing that. The Jeff Neal result was shocking. There's no other way to say it. But Neal is a guy who has had an interesting career himself, with battling the septic shock, I believe it was. So he's a guy who has had his arc somewhat compromised himself. Obviously just lost to Rakhmonov, but despite that shocking fact, you look at the other losses that Luque has had. Stephen Thompson in 2019 in a 3-round fight, and Leon Edwards in 2017 in a 3-round fight. Beyond that, he submitted Chiesa, even though he got hurt early in that fight. He still beat Chiesa, a fighter that was more with it at that point and had beaten Dos Anjos only a year earlier. Tapped Tyron Woodley in the first round, knocked out Randy Brown, which that win has, aged somewhat nicely. Beat Nico Price, beat Mike Perry by split decision. One of the only people to knock out Brian Barberena. This guy knocked out Jalen Turner. Knocked him out. Now, Turner was still a young buck at that point. But, again, Luque was a guy who, you see all this experience. It's amazing that he was able to knock out Muhammad the first time and has Turner on his resume as a knockout too, and as Barberena. I mean, the finishing upside in this fight has to be with Luque relative to Dos Anjos. If you're picking Dos Anjos, I think the only realistic path to victory that you're seeing here is he wins 15 minutes of these 25. And he does it with takedowns and fence grinding, because the open space striking here from damage, volume. I mean, Luque's going to have a 5.5 reach advantage. If he had half an inch more, I would give him another, point in terms of my grading. Because the 6-inch reach gap has proven to be something that is statistically very significant in matchups across weight classes. Luque is going to have the edge on the feet. I don't think there's any question. He's medically cleared. I expect him to be able to take damage against a fighter in Dos Anjos that has 5 knockouts in 32 MMA wins, 46 MMA appearances, and his last win by knockout was in the title fight with Cowboy Cerrone in 2015, which was almost 8 years ago. And In the 4 fights prior to that one, he had 2 of those 5 career knockouts. So his prime in terms of the damage being dealt was when he fought Jason High and Benson Henderson, and then Nate Diaz, Anthony Pettis, Donald Cerrone. And that's a murderer's row in 2014, 2015. But now we're in 2023, and Dos Anjos is 38 years old, staring down a 39th birthday in October. And he just got knocked out for the 3rd time in his career only a year ago on a brutal head kick from Fiziev. The other thing you have to consider here is that stoppage, there were some people that maybe thought it was kind of early, but at the age Dos Anjos age, with the mileage he has, you have to believe that they're going to want to save him from any like really, really bad suffering at this stage. So if Luque is able to hurt him even a little bit, as he's done with several of these fighters in the past, I think you need to be a little bit worried about that. I'll say the one thing that Dos Anjos does really have for him is that Luque's never won by unanimous decision in the UFC. The last fight he had before debuting, he won by unanimous decision. That's the only fight in his MMA career that he's won outright, according to the judges. Beyond that, every other result has had to have been a finish or a split decision in the case of his win over Mike Perry. So I'll be nervous the longer this goes. But the patterns here all line up for Luque getting a really, really nice statement return, establishing that he's back. You should listen to what his comments were before the Jeff Neal fight in terms of how much, high-level violence means to him. I think you're going to see that mentality that has been taken in the context of returning from a brain bleed and still wanting to do this, and the UFC still feeling confident enough in Luque that he can headline a fight night like this coming off of that dramatic of an injury, that he would want to do something like that. I think that this is I don't want to call it a passing of the torch moment, because I don't know what Luque's ceiling is relative to what we saw last year, but this feels like a career-saving moment for a guy in Luque facing someone in Dos Anjos that we know realistically is not a title contender anymore. This is a guy that is merely trying to save his ranking on the way out, I think, at this point. I don't know how far he's going to fall after this. I don't know what Luque's ceiling is beyond this. But I do know that this guy coming back, fighting a 39-year-old, somebody 7 years older than him, 38 years old, 7 years older than him, with a nearly half-inch reach advantage, with the volume edge and the accuracy edge on the feet. It's possible he gets taken down for 2 of the 3 rounds, but you're going to have a hard time convincing me that Luque is going to end up looking the more damaged after this fight than Dos Anjos does. And that's assuming it even goes the distance and Luque doesn't finish the guy that just got knocked out by a head kick a year ago. So give me Vincente Luque, and that's going to conclude the show for this week. Just under 90 minutes. Not too bad. I'll try to be more consistent going forward, but shit don't cost nothing, right? I mean, goddamn, this is free. I'm grateful. Like I genuinely feel like bad now when I put out like, oh, it's I'm delaying it. Sorry, because I'm fucking lazy or whatever other reason. And then people are like sharing it on Twitter, like, no, it's cool, man. Like, we'll help people, let them know that we'll understand. It's like, oh, great. They're actually showing me love now on social media for this stuff. I feel obligated to provide a product, even if it is free. So I told you guys if you help me get to 500 followers, I would give you the free podcast. And here we are, barely 2 months later, and we're up another 200 followers and up even more units. So it's been a blessing to speak to all of you about these fights. Thank you for tuning in. We will be back next week for, is it 292 next week? When you do this shit on a week-by-week basis, it's easy to lose track of what's coming up. It is 292 next week. Sterling and Sugar Show, let's go. And we got Zhang Wei Li and Amanda Lemos. I'm not going to break that one down, but I love me some Zhang Wei Li. That woman is ferocious. Neil Magny, Ian Gary saving the show. That's going to be very interesting. I've already been talking with my fellow sharp Marcus of the Nubian Bookstore about that one. So I'm going to be looking at that one closely. Mario Batista, Cody Garbrandt, very interesting too. Also Pedro Munoz, Marlon Vera. So a host of interesting fights next week. I'll be looking forward to talking about all of them with each of you, but we have a card this weekend to win. I already relayed what the 3-leg's going to be. If you know how I build these parlays, you can probably guess how the other ones are going to get built. Those are going to go out tomorrow afternoon. I do want to give you a quick warning prior to next week that I am going to be traveling in the later stages of next week. I'll try to have RAXPOD scheduled for Thursday before I leave because I'll be traveling Thursday. But in terms of parlays going out and reporting on the picks, next weekend is going to be difficult because I am going to be out and about and celebrating an event with longtime friends. So just giving you that bit of grace for the true hardcore fans of MMA Rax that have made it to the end of this show. I'm going to be a little bit AWOL next weekend, but I will do my best to get the picks out and the show out prior to next weekend, and then I will be a bit touch and go with the betting stuff from there, just to be transparent. So I appreciate your bit of grace while I've worked through the last couple of weeks of being a bit MIA from a content perspective. And again, it's a free product. It will be a bit turbulent every now and then, but I'm never going to ask you for your money. I will be very, very steadfast in that. There was a big sharp this week that very famously pivoted to going from free format to paid one, like paid exclusive Discord or whatever. I am not going to do that shit. I will not do that shit. I want to build this to be the biggest thing it can possibly be, but I need the public's help with that, and I need to curry public favor, and I do that by giving you a free product. So I appreciate all of your favor that I've curried to this point. Please like, share, and subscribe on Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, Threads, everywhere. Do it all. I need all of it. But thank you, and we'll be back for UFC 292. I look forward to it. It's going to be a sugar show to remember, win or lose for Mr. Sean O'Malley. So thank you very much for tuning into the MMA RAXPOD, and take care, folks. We'll see you next week.